Hello, my name is Mark Saunders, and this is one of a series of YouTube videos I've created on research ethics and consent. This one looks at consent forms. More broadly, this is one of a large number of videos on research methods and methodology I've created, which you can find on my YouTube channel, Mark Saunders on Research Methods. And the link to the channel is on the bottom left-hand corner of each slide. In this video presentation, we're going to start by looking at different forms of consent. And then we're going to look at what those who are consenting, the subjects of the research, be they participants or be they respondents, need to know. We're then going to look at what we mean by informed consent and what people need to know, and then move on to issues of deception and incomplete disclosure and when they might be allowed. Although for many universities and organisations, deception is a complete no and should not be undertaken. I'm then going to give you some example consent forms, both for interviews, observation and for questionnaires. And as usual, we'll finish up with references and further reading. So let's now look at different forms of consent, and we're going to start by looking at lack of consent. This is when our research subject lacks the knowledge about the research to be able to consent to what's happening. It also occurs when a researcher is deceptive, so they use deception to those they're collecting data from and don't tell them what the research is about in some way, and we'll return to this later in a subsequent slide. The next form of consent is inferred consent. Here, the subject may not fully understand their rights, but what happens very often, especially with questionnaires, is that the researcher infers consent from their return of the questionnaire. Another way a research can infer consent is with implied consent, and this is when, for example, a manager grants access and the researcher thinks because the manager has said that they can undertake the research, that the participant has consented to the research. The final form I want to consider is informed consent, and it's here that our research subject, be they a participant for interviews or a respondent for questionnaires, gives their consent freely, and this is based on the full information about the research and their rights and what participation will actually involve. So let's look at consenting and what the subjects involved in the research need to know. For inferred consent, we need to remember that the subject involved may or indeed may not understand the implications of participating, and we're just referring their consent because they've actually taken part. For example, when a questionnaire is returned and a person's just sent it back, we have assumed they've consented to take part. And what we've done here as a researcher is assume they've consented without actually clarifying whether or not they have. With informed consent, our research subjects give their consent to participate freely, and they're fully informed and understand about the research before they actually give their consent. So they know the nature of the research, the purpose of research, how the research data is going to be used, and crucially, their role within it, and the fact that they can withdraw at any time. So, in informed consent, the subject involved confirms that they understand the following. They understand what the research is about. As I just mentioned, that their participation is voluntary and they can withdraw at any time without any impact on themselves. They know how their personal data will be processed and how anonymised quotations and photographs will be used, if at all. And then finally and crucially, they actually agree to participate. I'd like to stress here that it's really important that you check your university's web pages for advice, because there's lots of advice on these and this is still very much an overview. So informed consent requires you as a researcher, shown here in purple, to give some information. You have to give the information. Here we have a longer list about the purpose of the research, the statement that participation is voluntary and can withdraw at any time, the research procedures, so actually what's going to happen and the time they're likely to take, so how long an interview is going to last, how long it will take to complete a questionnaire, and this needs to be realistic rather than optimistic, the risks and benefits of taking part, compensation, if any, which will be given, and for many universities actually compensating participants is not permitted, and the amount of compensation will be the method that this is going to be given and the timing, so when they're going to get the compensation. Whether and how confidentiality will be protected, so their individual research participants' confidentiality, how is it going to make sure that they cannot be have their responses get back to them, and that people will not know what they've said. They also need to be clear about whether and how anonymity will be protected. In other words, that they cannot be identified at all, and they are completely anonymous. And also some researcher contact information, so the person who has given the information and the researcher can easily be contacted. The participant or the respondent, or if you want to use a more general term, the subject, then needs to show that they understand. But this is not sufficient for consent, because consent is not just about understanding, it's also about agreeing to participate. We need to stop a moment and think about deception or incomplete disclosure. And the picture here shows what incomplete disclosure can look like. There's parts which have been remained hidden, in this case under the table. Now, some universities and some organisations may allow a waiver or alteration of informed consent. So what that means is they may waive the subject's understanding of purpose or procedures. So you don't actually tell them anything. But there needs to be an incredibly good justification for this. What will not be waived is risks or harm to the participants or research subjects, or indeed the respondents. So what we're looking at here is deception, which is rarely allowed. This is active misinformation, so telling lies, or incomplete disclosure, where specific details about the research are withheld at the time, but they're remedied later by debriefing of those subjects involved. Let's now look at an example of a simple consent form. This will start with the project title obviously in bold. This will be followed by a statement outlining issues associated with the confidentiality of the information given. And it will start with something like the confidentiality of personal information and the anonymity of all those involved in this investigation will be preserved in the following ways. And then there'll be a list of ways. Following this, and at the end, there will be a place where the subject has to sign and give their consent. And this will say something like, I understand the nature and purpose of the research study being conducted. I've had the opportunity to discuss it with the researchers and to ask any questions. I agree to take part in the above project, and I have been informed that I am free to withdraw at any time. And then there's a signature and it's dated. Let's now look at an example of an interview or overt observation consent form. And by overt observation, we mean observation where the participants know they're actually being observed. And the first thing to note is that the information sheet has been read and you don't sign the consent form until afterwards and the subject's questions have been answered by the researcher. Now, the first thing that obviously needs to be on this consent form is the title of the research. This is followed by the name and the position of the researcher, and then we have the issues and things that they need to sign against. So there's first of all a confirmation of what they've done. So they confirm they've read and understood the information sheet, that they understand their participation is voluntary and they're free to withdraw, and they agree to take part in the study. They also sign to agree, perhaps, to be audio recorded, hence there's a yes/no box, to video recorded, again a yes/no box, and to the use of anonymised quotes in publications, again a yes/no box. So you're giving the subject the power to decide whether or not to do these things. And then finally, the consent form is signed both by the participant and the researcher. And here we have the request for respondents' consent. Starts off by saying, thank you for your interest in this research. Before you start the questionnaire, I, that's you as researcher, need to make sure you know what my research is about, what your involvement will be, and for you to confirm that you agree to take part. In other words, that you consent. And then we have a series of statements which they have to agree to. And it says, by agreeing to take part in this research, you are confirming the following. I am participating in a research study. I have been given an explanation of research I'm about to participate in, and I know what this involves. This is why it's important to explain what it involves in the previous statements. My participation in this research is entirely voluntary, and I am free to withdraw at any time without explanation. My identity cannot be linked to my data, and information I give remains anonymous. If we state this, we have to make sure we actually do it. And then finally, if I have any questions about research, I can contact, and then the contact person's email address and phone number. And then finally, It says, do you agree to take part, yes or no? If the respondent clicks on yes, it takes them to the first question of the questionnaire, and if the respondent says no, it takes them to the end and says thank you for considering it, and then that's it, so they don't have to record any information. So there you have how to explain to your potential respondent what your research is about, and then how to gain informed consent. I just wanted to put a slide in about consent and vulnerable populations. Now, vulnerable groups or populations require additional considerations and protections, and it's not the purpose of this video presentation to go into them, just to highlight them so that you know that you need to think further. Children, prisoners and pregnant women are examples of such vulnerable groups, but other groups that might possibly need additional considerations and protections are people who are economically disadvantaged, people who are cognitively impaired, people who have low literacy because they can't actually read consent forms perhaps, and students or employees of the person who's undertaking the investigation. And I just want to also stress that for vulnerable populations, gatekeepers can give or withhold access, but they cannot give or withhold consent. That needs to be thought of in relation to the vulnerable population and those people. I also want to stress that it's important to keep records of consenting. So when you obtain these permissions, make sure you've got consent for interviewing, or the consent for the observation or online observation, or for questionnaires. You need these, and then keep records of all permissions and consents given, be they a consent form or a verbal consent or a video consent, but make sure you keep them so you have all the information. I'd like to finish by just giving a couple of references here. The first of these is Emma Bell and Alan Bryman's paper in the British Journal of Management on the ethics of management research. This, I think, is a wonderful paper, and please do read it. And secondly, please do look at the second half of chapter 6 in my textbook with Phil and Adrian, Research Methods for Business Students. I hope you found this YouTube video presentation useful, and I'd be really grateful if you'd subscribe to my channel, Mark Saunders on Research Methods, and also told your friends and colleagues about the channel as well. I'm adding new videos to the channel nearly every week, and hopefully they'll be of help to you in your own research.